I think we'll stop with the second one actually, which was why do you think music is able to access the parts that other stimuli cannot, for instance, in these demented patients?
This may in part be the same sort of question as to why is musical performance preserved when other things can be lost. Although one's intelligence and sensibility and one's cerebral cortex is involved in learning music, once I think one has heard music, and it may be rehearsed and repeated internally, once you know a piece of music, it gets down lower in the brain into areas like the cerebellum and the basal ganglia. Basically, when an amnesic person or a demented person, or indeed when anyone sort of thinks of music, it is played internally. There's an internal performance. And the sort of memory which is involved in performance, which psychologists call procedural memory, is located at very deep levels in the brain, as I say, and that and it is these deep levels which are accessed and which are preserved. With someone like I wrote a bit about Clive Waring, and Jonathan Miller there made an absolutely wonderful film of Clive in 1986 called Prison of Consciousness. Now, Clive has lost his explicit memory of events, and for that matter, of music. If you asked him for a particular piece of Bach, does he know it? He'd say no, never heard of it, possibly never heard of Bach. Start him playing it, sing the first note, and it'll come up beautifully. And an expression of astonishment may appear on his face as he discovers that he can perform it. But 5 seconds later, he will not only not remember it, but will again say he doesn't know the piece. And so I think it's especially this sort of implicit memory which is involved.
I'm afraid we'll just leave it and move on. Question over here.
I'd like to hear your views on the evolution of music, because the opinions seem to run the gamut from it doesn't matter at all to it's the basis of the evolution of language, and somewhere in between that it has a social role in evolution.
Okay, the question was, what's your take on the evolution of music?
One can only have a take. You need a time machine to investigate this. There have been very various opinions. Darwin has an entire chapter in The Descent of Man about music, and he thought that music had evolved very early for purposes of sexual selection and for courtship and securing a mate. And that speech was secondary to this. Herbert Spencer, had the opposite opinion. Rousseau, who was an important composer as well as a writer, thought there had been some primal form of expression and communication which was inseparably verbal and musical, a sort of articulate music, which then, if you want, separated. William James is rather dismissive about music. In the entire 1,500 pages of the Principles, he has only one sentence about music, and that's rather dismissive. He says it's of no zoological utility. It's a pure incident of having a hearing organ. He says, like the susceptibility to seasickness. Incidentally, one can find virtually no reference in the works of William James or Henry James to music, or whether they in fact were a pair of music brothers. I don't know. And in our own time, Steven Pinker has written rather similarly. He speaks of music as auditory cheesecake, as something trivial, and he said music could vanish tomorrow and life would be just the same. I don't think so myself. I think one has to explain why music appears and is central and important and highly esteemed in every culture. We have known why one can find bone flutes which are 50,000 years old with tonal intervals fairly similar to those of a diatonic scale now. I think one also has to explain this business of, this exclusively human business of reacting to music motorically, which you don't find in any non-human primate, and which actually has no analogue in speech. The pulse of rhythm has no analogue, and so I think one has to suppose that at least rhythmic sense developed autonomously and by itself. Tonality, who knows? What is clear is that the human brain is uniquely equipped to deal with rapid, complex, segmented streams of sound, whether it's speech or song, and to produce them. And who cares what came first?
There's a question right at the back.
Have those persons who suffer, who have amusia, do they have they given any indication that they can find any sound aesthetically pleasing, let alone music?
Yes, the question was, people with amusia, is there any evidence that they can find any sound, not just music, aesthetically pleasing?
Yes, certainly the lady I saw, enjoyed various ambient sounds, as the rustling of leaves or whatever. I think that with regard to speech, with regard to ambient sounds of every sort, forest murmurs, etc. And I think most urban sounds are awful. She had quite a pleasant soundscape and speechscape, but there was just no musicscape. But conceivably, this question could be answered by one of the young people from Ireland, if he or she is not too shy.
Up to you, Anne. Would you like to give your perspective on whether it's possible, whether you can get pleasure out of other sounds apart from music?
Absolutely. The flowing of a stream, the tinkle of a waterfall, the rustling of leaves, the bird song.
But would you identify with the case that Professor Sachs talked about, that music sounds quite noisy?
It depends on the music, really.
Yeah.
Bach would be definitely a din. Definitely would not be in my repertoire. Bruce Springsteen, I can cope with.
Bruce Springsteen's bit of Bach tonight.
I like something with a bit of welly.
It has to have a bit of welly. Okay.
Sorry, Jonathan.
But Oliver, isn't it true that rhythmicity is not confined to the musical experience? That you watch people talking, watching you talking, you are moving your hands rhythmically in time to the prosodic sequence of your talk. Now, are we actually going to say from that, or deduce from that, that there might be some deep evolutionary relationship between the melody and indeed prosody of speech and the subsequent development of music? Because what is most characteristic about music is the fact that it's a cultural development which is in fact a late development, not an early one. And it may well be, and I'd like to put this up as a proposition to you, that it's not unlike what Stephen Jay Gould and Lewontin talk about when they talked about the spandrels of San Marco, that it may be an exaptation, not an adaptation. It may be something which is associated and riding pickerback on something which is of selective advantage, but only subsequently comes to be a personal social advantage. That it's not evolutionarily determined, it's an exaptation.
Yeah, well, this is partly how people think, and also William James, who has an interesting phrase when he suggests that music gets in through the back door. Certainly one, there is a melody and rhythm in one's speech and in one's gestures, and gesturing and mimesis are sort of really as human as speech and music. Well, perhaps so. Perhaps so.
Marcus.